The story of Boston Garden actually starts in Alaska, where the arena's developer first began creating his fortune. Tex Rickard had been born in 1870 in Kansas City, Missouri, but was raised in Sherman, Texas. After discovery of gold in Alaska, Rickard soon relocated there before moving to the Yukon Territory during the Klondike Gold Rush. He allegedly sold his lot for $60,000 and used the money afterward to build a saloon, hotel, and gambling parlor where he eventually lost his stake by gambling it away. After this defeat, Rickard began tending bar and promoting boxing matches, where he would put on said event and collect a profit from tickets after expenses and the prize money was paid. Citing early success, he relocated to Goldfield, Nevada and opened another saloon and casino, and by the 1910s, Rickard was profiting $60,000 to $100,000 per fight, and he subsequently began opening more saloons, all under the name Northern. After a failed business venture in South America, where he had also joined Theodore Roosevelt on his expedition of the Rio de Duvida in the Amazon rainforest, Rickard returned to promoting boxing matches, but this time in New York City. And it wouldn't be long before he promoted the first fight to ever have a prize over $1 million in 1921, and Rickard made $550,000 on that fight alone. To host his events, he had used New York City's Madison Square Garden, from which he had to share revenue. Being built in 1890, its limited capacity design never had the popularity of Rickard's boxing matches in mind. So, in 1923, Rickard decided to solve both of his problems by acquiring the naming rights to MSG and founded the Madison Square Garden Corporation before buying property on 8th Avenue and 49th Street in Manhattan, and constructed the third version of Madison Square Garden, which opened in 1925, before the fourth and most recent version would be constructed in 1968, Rickard founding the Rangers hockey franchise in his venue's second year. By acquiring naming rights, it was his intention to begin building boxing arenas all over the country under the company's name. At the same time, Boston and Maine Railroad had been looking to replace the city's Union Station in what was a long overdue project. The company originally set out to construct a new rail terminal and corporate headquarters in a new development called North Station. Boston real estate developer James Walsh caught wind of both B&M's and Rickard's plans, and considering that Boston's largest arena at the time, appropriately called Boston Arena, could only hold 5,000 spectators, Walsh saw an incredible opportunity to build an entertainment complex that would house a brand new arena and 500-room hotel with a rail terminal underneath to bring in people from around the region to attend events, making Boston the premier sports, convention, and event hub on the East Coast. B&M, Rickard, and a group of developers all came to an agreement on the project, and Rickard set out to top his already astounding achievement of Madison Square Garden 3, spending double the money to do so. Ground was broken in December 1927, and construction only took 11 months. Boston Garden's first event was a boxing match between Honey Boy, Dick Finnegan, and Andre Rutis, which was followed up by a hockey game 3 days later between the Boston Bruins and Montreal Canadiens. Rickard would abruptly die from a ruptured appendix only 2 months after the arena opened while organizing a fight in Miami Beach, and once his body returned to New York, thousands lined the streets of Manhattan to pay their respects to the man who made boxing fights so famous he had to construct his own arenas to house them, which coincidentally also hosted his funeral. Boston Garden was completed at a cost of $10 million in 1928 dollars. It had a capacity of 13,900 for hockey, but the NHL didn't have a standard hockey rink size yet, and so the arena ended up having a hockey rink that was 9 feet shorter and 2 feet narrower than what would eventually become the league standard size. The Bruins would go on to win the Stanley Cup Final in Boston Garden's opening year, winning 2 more championships over the next decade and a half before going on hiatus during World War II. In 1932, the Garden hosted what could be considered the first indoor arena concert, as Benny Goodman was joined by Rudy Vallée and his orchestra in a battle of the bands. Even with the venue's early success, Rickard had constructed the Garden as a boxing arena, with steep and shallow grandstands meant to keep spectators as close to the boxing ring as possible, no matter where they were sitting. Of course, this meant the concourses were significantly undersized, and while the number of the Garden's wooden seats seemed more than appropriate for the time, they were cramped and narrow, and the small confines of the arena's building site limited opportunities for expansion as professional sports grew in popularity, including for sports that came later. Unfortunately, the Madison Square Garden Corporation's ambition of opening namesake arenas all over the country died once Rickard did, and it didn't help that the country had entered a steep depression. After the crash of 1929, attendance to hockey games and boxing matches plummeted. And so 6 years after Rickard's death, the company decided to part ways with Boston Garden, selling the management rights to the Boston Arena Corporation, who was managing Boston Arena, former home to the Bruins. George V. Brown took over as general manager of the facility and was able to string enough traveling ice shows together, known at the time as ice capades, to keep the arena afloat. While hockey attendance did eventually rebound, there was no longer enough demand to support multiple fights per week as boxing attendance failed to recover after the Great Depression, and after George Brown's death in 1937, his son Walter took over management of the Garden and saw a new opportunity on the horizon. Professional basketball had been around for several decades at this point, but hadn't yet found solid footing. Early leagues such as the American Basketball League crashed along with the stock market in 1929, and the National Basketball League was only playing in high school gyms in smaller markets. Brown believed that elevating the game to larger hockey arenas in big markets would be well received and provide another source of revenue for his arena. And so, he decided to mortgage his house and found a new league called the Basketball Association of America, with managers of Madison Square Garden, Philadelphia Arena, and Chicago Stadium getting on board, along with managers of 7 additional arenas around the country buying in for the league's first year. Walter Brown, more specifically the Boston Arena Corporation, became an owner of one of the new clubs, which became known as the Boston Celtics, and would play the Garden on nights there wasn't a hockey game. To accommodate its newest tenant, Brown had an alternating direction parquet wood floor added to the Garden, and there is some dispute as to why Brown chose the distinctive pattern, as the record shows that a floor of similar design was already in use at Boston Arena, but the Celtics claim on their official website that lumber was in short supply immediately following World War II, and most of the lumber that did exist was segregated for use on residential homes for returning servicemen. So, the construction company that Brown contracted with ended up using whatever scraps Boston lumber yards had, which was enough to complete a parquet floor design in time for the Celtics' first game of existence, with a more finished-looking version coming later. The unique playing surface ended up having several dead spots where a basketball wouldn't bounce very well, and Celtic players claimed to have used this defect to their advantage, contributing to their long-standing home court success. After the formation of the Celtics, this was now the first time anyone had to alternate between hockey and basketball games. The Celtics typically alternated games between Boston Arena and Boston Garden during the hockey season, but on certain occasions, Garden officials would lay the basketball floor without removing the ice, leading to condensation collecting in puddles on the floor. On top of that, the Garden lacked an HVAC system, leading to fog forming during the Stanley Cup playoffs in the spring to early summer, hurting play and attendance. The Basketball Association of America had to rely on former college basketball stars to bring in fans, but eventually the BAA began drawing in teams from the rival National Basketball League, and the two agreed to merge in 1949, which created the National Basketball Association. After the NBA was formed, Walter Brown's Celtics went off like dynamite, winning their first NBA Finals in Boston Garden in 1957, led by NBA Hall of Famer Bill Russell, before bringing the championship games back to the arena every year for a decade straight, winning 11 championships in 13 years. Coincidentally, in 1957, Boston Garden became the first arena to host the NBA Finals and Stanley Cup Finals at the same time, which would also occur the following year, before the Bruins began a decade-long playoff drought after the 1958-59 season. John F. Kennedy would host a presidential rally at the Garden in 1960 that wound up being standing room only, with 100,000 spectators standing outside the arena. Around the same time, the Boston Garden Arena Corporation had acquired the Bruins, meaning that the Garden, Celtics, and Bruins were all owned by the same entity. However, Brown eventually bought the Celtics in his own name, so despite being the manager of the Garden through the BGAC, the Celtics were now a separate entity paying rent to lease the Garden for home games. This will matter later. By the 1970s, the National Basketball Association had started to pick up significantly in popularity, and its rivalry with the American Basketball Association, who brought professional basketball to new markets, only accelerated the growth of both. It was during this decade that municipalities and smaller markets began taking professional sports seriously, and most constructed their first basketball-specific or football-specific venues. This round of new construction made Boston Garden feel more obsolete than it already was. Designed as a boxing arena, it technically wasn't large enough for the now agreed-upon dimensions for the sports it hosted. It had the smallest capacity of any arena used for professional sports in the country, and while its original design was meant to keep fans close to the action, it was incredibly cramped with already small and decades-old seats, and aisles obstructed by structural pillars, where fans filed into hallways after games instead of open concourses. On top of all of that, the Garden still lacked an air conditioning system, and the new arenas coming online had begun experimenting with skyboxes and luxury suites, something that the Garden obviously couldn't accommodate. Conditions at the arena had gotten so bad that starting in 1974, the Celtics would cease playing their entire home game schedule in Boston and began moving several home games to the Hartford Civic Center in Hartford, Connecticut. This was amidst the Celtics' 1970s dynasty reaching 5 straight Eastern Conference Finals, and it wouldn't be long after before the dawn of the Larry Bird era in the early 1980s, where once again the Celtics would build another dynasty, with a player straight from the basketball mecca as its centerpiece, making 5 NBA Finals appearances in 8 years, and setting the record for home court dominance at a 40-1 record in the 1985-86 season that still stands today, with only the 2015-2016 San Antonio Spurs tying the legendary feat. In addition to the Celtics' success, the Bruins, led by Bobby Orr and Wayne Cashman, would make their first return to the Stanley Cup Finals since 1958 in the early 1970s, winning 2 Stanley Cups in 3 years and making 5 total appearances during the decade. The attention and prestige both the Celtics and Bruins brought to Boston with their winning ways certainly gave the city a positive spin on its reputation that it needed, but Boston Garden demonstrated time and time again that while Boston had 2 of the best sports franchises in the country, it had nowhere near the best arena, which often failed in the biggest moments. The arena's lack of air conditioning, coupled with the NBA playing the finals in early to mid-June, led the Garden to get unbearably hot. The temperature inside the arena during Game 5 of the 1984 NBA Finals against the Lakers reached 97 degrees Fahrenheit, and medical staff had to provide oxygen tanks to Lakers players during the game, with things only getting worse after that. During Game 4 of the 1988 Stanley Cup Finals, Boston Garden, which still operated off the original electrical infrastructure installed in the 1920s, lost power entirely in the middle of the second period after the Oilers scored a game-tying goal and backup generators failed to turn on. The game ended up being suspended and played in Edmonton 2 days later, with the Oilers eventually taking the series. Only 2 years later, in the 1990 Stanley Cup Finals between the same 2 teams, an incident occurred where the lights went out during the first overtime in Game 1 of the series. This time the lights were able to be turned back on, and it took 2 additional overtime periods to decide the game for the Oilers, who once again won the series. Officials had known for quite some time how inadequate the Garden was, but 2 decades of trying to replace it had only proven fruitless. With all this success but lacking a fitting facility to match, in 1972, Boston Mayor Kevin White announced a new 18,000-seat arena in South Station, but lacked funding to back the plan, and the Garden and Bruins owner at the time, Storer Broadcasting, didn't have the money either, and sold both only a few years later. The Celtics would then try negotiating with the Boston suburb of Quincy, but that ended up going nowhere as well. It's worth noting here that because the Bruins and Celtics were separately owned, each went their own separate way in pursuit of a new arena, and the lack of a combined effort arguably contributed to each team's lack of success in negotiating a new venue. By the end of the 1970s, the 2 teams began infighting, as the Celtics believed the Bruins were charging unfair rent for use of the now well-known outdated facility. This led as far as the Celtics owner to threaten building their own arena, either at the Suffolk Down Horse Racetrack in East Boston with the aid of the track's owners, or right behind Boston Garden itself with the help of the Boston Redevelopment Authority. While the Celtics were making these threats to have their own arena built in Boston, the Bruins were making threats to leave the state entirely, having conversations with officials in Salem, New Hampshire, who also had the idea of constructing an arena at a horse racetrack in the dormant Rockingham Park. Both teams, however, hit a dead end when the respective state legislatures failed to support proposals brought to them. Citing the Bruins attempting to flee, one of Massachusetts U.S. Senators, Paul Zongas, got involved and formed a committee to come up with a plan for building a new arena, including how it would be paid for. Their proposal went as far as signing a naming rights deal and developing a long-term funding plan, but unfortunately they were unable to avoid the need for state tax dollars, and the measure died in the state legislature. By this point, Boston Garden was approaching 60 years old, and a city that had lost a third of its population due to 3 decades of white flight. Investing state tax dollars in what was a declining city seemed all but necessary to resurrect it, yet was highly unpopular. And given how long it had taken to come up with a plan for a new venue, there were now calls for the Garden to be preserved on the National Register of Historic Places, creating another hurdle to a new arena. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, the Massachusetts Historical Commission decided against designating historic status, removing any such roadblock to redeveloping the site. However, this didn't mean that the people of Boston were suddenly now okay with tearing the arena down. Proposals now encompassed redeveloping the entire North Station site, of which the original hotel built shortly after the Garden had already been demolished and replaced. And despite idea after idea coming about, the Boston Redevelopment Authority, who ultimately had to approve the project, would find some fault and toss the idea out. Delaware North, a Buffalo-based food and hospitality company who had bought the Bruins and the Garden from Storer Broadcasting in 1975, then proposed another redevelopment concept that remodeled Boston Garden instead of replacing it. However, Senator Zongas and his committee hadn't given up yet, and at this point, doubted whether Delaware North was capable of getting a redevelopment plan approved by the BRA, period. Zongas brought in a reputable developer in Rosalind Gorin and several notable local politicians to add to the committee's credibility, but also brought in former Bruins Wayne Cashman and Bobby Orr, hoping to sway public opinion in his favor. Zongas' committee, now led by developer Gorin, submitted their own proposal, which originally called for Delaware North to sell them the Bruins and the Garden, but the company passed on negotiations, and the committee then called for the city of Boston to take the Garden from Delaware North by eminent domain, so that they could use a mix of private financing and creative tax increases on hotels to build a replacement to the Garden and a mixed-use complex. But this request was obviously a stretch. And so, finally, after decades of trial and rejection, the Boston Redevelopment Authority decided to award Delaware North the right to redevelop the entire North Station site despite Gorin's efforts. It was estimated that the entire project would top $700 million and entail a new arena constructed on a 3-acre parking lot owned by the city behind Boston Garden, hotel, 2 commercial office towers, and rerouting and upgrading rail lines that would sit below the development, in addition to thousands of parking spaces that would also sit under the new construction. Officials suggested that a new arena could be ready by 1992, but lingering effects of the 1980s recession delayed the project from starting, and officials stated further that given the complexity of the project and the additional financing that would be required, there was no guarantee that an arena would be constructed at all. Regardless, the completion of this step was a significant moment in the history of Boston. Mayor Raymond Flynn, who was instrumental in the negotiations, and Governor Michael Dukakis were a few of several who spoke at a press conference celebrating the milestone. After years of decline, Dukakis declared that Boston is, quote, a world-class city that deserves a world-class facility. Conflict between the state legislature and Jeremy Jacobs, the chairman of Delaware North, would continue for several years, namely over items that today are debated as part of the community benefit agreement. But then, after a generation of waiting, groundbreaking for Boston Garden's replacement took place on April 29, 1993, 4 years after the new arena had been announced. Throughout construction, only 9 inches separated the exterior walls of the 2 venues, and once infrastructure and the modified rail lines were set, it took a little over 2 years to complete the new arena. One of the reasons why it took so long to break ground was that Delaware North sought out entirely private financing for the project, and ultimately, a collection of regional banks, namely Shawmut Bank and Fleet Bank, put up the funds. On top of financing, the two were also placing competing offers for naming rights to the venue, which Shawmut eventually won. The bank's color scheme and branding were then added to the new facility, but right before the arena opened, Shawmut Bank and Fleet Bank announced that they would be merging and that Fleet Bank would be absorbing Shawmut, effectively eliminating the brand. And so a mad scramble took place to replace all the signage and colors from the now non-existent company, including replacing every single seat in the arena, as every single one had been stamped with the bank's logo. The night before the grand opening, officials decided to host an official farewell celebration to Boston Garden. Thousands flocked to the soon-to-be demolished Boston icon to take one final glance at Tex Rickard's boxing arena, where many families had built memories across 3 or more generations. Dozens of athletes and entertainers who had built their careers inside the Garden's walls came out to share their gratitude and memories. None more special than the testimonies from Celtics great Larry Bird and Bruins legend Bobby Orr. The night concluded with the releasing of balloons and a swan song symphony from the Boston Pops Orchestra. The front page in the next day's Boston Globe read, "All New England has lost a friend." And the somber yet celebratory day was succeeded by the opening of the new FleetCenter the next day, on September 30th, 1995. The Bruins played their last home game at Boston Garden 4 months prior in the Eastern Conference quarterfinal, but would play a preseason home game the following season against the Montreal Canadiens to officially wrap up their time at the arena. The team's history at the Garden coming full circle. Afterwards, they would host a special post-game ceremony in which they removed all their championship banners and memorabilia, in what became the Garden's last sporting event just 4 days before it was permanently closed. The Celtics suffered a similar fate, losing their final game in the opening round of the 1995 NBA playoffs against the Shaq-led Orlando Magic. The Celtics would go on to use the same parquet floor at the FleetCenter that they used in the Boston Garden until the end of 1999, at which point the floor was chopped up and auctioned off with other Boston Garden souvenirs. The electromechanical scoreboard that sat over the playing floor was moved to Arsenal Mall in Watertown, west of Boston, until 2018, when the mall went under renovations. The scoreboard was then sold and moved to an apartment complex where it appears to have been altered and perhaps cut in half. Boston Garden would sit vacant for the next 3 years while demolition permits and construction timelines played out. Once everything was sorted out, crews began clawing at the near 70-year-old structure in April of 1998. The proximity of the neighboring FleetCenter only allowed demolition crews to go a few feet at a time, giving fans a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to capture themselves with the slowly decaying ruins of the soon-to-be-forgotten landmark. Once it was demolished, the site was converted into a parking lot that housed construction personnel and arena staff for the next near 2 decades before the final phase of the North Station redevelopment plan began in 2016. The hub on Causeway, a set of mixed-use buildings, opened in the spring of 2021, over 23 years after Boston Garden had been demolished, and nearly a century after Tex Rickard agreed to bring boxing to Boston. Rickard's grand vision of a nationwide chain of boxing arenas didn't get very far, but the people of Boston I'm sure are grateful that he made it as far as he did, even if the Boston Garden lasted a lot longer than it should have. Its shallow and yellow grandstands live in every Larry Bird highlight video, and the distinctive 16 NBA World Championships, 5 Stanley Cup Championships, and countless memorable nights in its history certainly make the Garden a historic venue whose legacy deserves to be preserved. After all, that's why we do this.